My son watched from the window as the train pulled away, leaving me stranded on a freezing platform with nothing but the clothes on my back. He had my wallet, my phone, and 40 years of my savings. He thought he was discarding a useless old burden, but he forgot that I spent my entire life controlling the rails he was riding on. I did not just get mad. I got even, and the whole world watched it happen. My name is Eleanor Hart. I am 67 years old. For most of my life, I was a dispatcher for Northwind Rail and Freight, managing the flow of thousands of tons of steel and cargo across the Midwest. I know the rhythm of the tracks better than I know the sound of my own heartbeat. But right now, none of that matters. I am currently sitting on a hard metal bench in the security holding office of a small station called Grayford Junction in Colorado. My denim jacket is frayed at the cuffs and offers no protection against the mountain chill seeping through the walls. My shoes are covered in platform dust. The air in this small room smells of stale coffee that has been burning on a hot plate for hours and the metallic tang of rusting iron from the tracks outside. I reached into my pocket again, a phantom reflex, but there was nothing there. I have no wallet. I have no phone. I have no ticket. I have absolutely no identification to prove that I am a person who exists. The security guard, a heavy man with a uniform that strained at the buttons, looked at me with tired skepticism. He did not see a woman who spent 40 years keeping trains from colliding in the dark. He saw a disheveled senior citizen who looked like she had wandered away from a care home. He asked me again if I had anyone he could call, his tone suggesting he did not believe I had anyone at all. The station public address system crackled overhead, spitting out a garbled announcement for a commuter line that sounded miles away. On the wall, a digital clock flickered, the red numbers changing with a mockery of precision. Outside, I could hear the faint, rhythmic grinding of wheels on rails in the distance. It was a sound that used to comfort me, but now it just sounded like a door slamming shut. That sound was the train leaving. That sound was my son leaving. I took a breath and tried to keep my voice steady. I told the guard my full name again. I gave him my date of birth. June 14th, 1957. I explained that I was on a vacation with my son, Daniel Hart, and his wife and daughter. I told him we were passengers on the Western Star Express. I told him exactly where we were sitting. The guard sighed, spinning his chair around to face a computer monitor that looked as old as the station itself. He typed with agonizing slowness, hunting and pecking at the keys. After a long minute, he stopped typing. He did not turn around immediately. When he finally looked at me, his expression was flat. He told me that there was no passenger named Eleanor Hart listed on the manifest for the Western Star Express this afternoon. The room seemed to tilt. I felt a physical blow to my chest. I remembered the dinner I ate in the dining car the night before. I remembered the smell of the linens in the sleeper cabin. I remembered the texture of the napkin in my lap. But the system said I was never there. It was as if I had been erased. If my name was not on that computer, then as far as the law was concerned, I was just a crazy woman making up stories in a train station. A young female employee standing near the filing cabinet leaned over and whispered something to the guard. She did not lower her voice enough. I heard the words dementia and confused. She looked at me with a pity that felt worse than hatred. She thought I was senile. She thought I had imagined an entire life. I swallowed hard, feeling the hot pressure of tears behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. If I cried, they would call a doctor. If I screamed, they would call the police. I had to be as hard as the rails I used to command. I looked past the guard, out the dirty window to the empty track where the train had been 20 minutes ago. I replayed the moment in my head. Daniel had smiled. He had told me to go stretch my legs. He said he would watch my bag. He urged me off the train. He knew exactly how long the stop was. My son did not forget me on that platform. He left me there. It was a choice. Above the guard, a black dome camera was mounted to the ceiling. A single red light blinked on it, steady and unfeeling like a mechanical eye. It was recording everything in this miserable room. I stared directly into that red lens. They thought they had discarded me in a place where no one would look. But they forgot that I know how the system works. I looked at that blinking red light and realized that if I wanted to survive this, I had to make sure the entire world looked through that camera with me. I did not grow up in a soft world. My childhood in a gritty industrial town in Ohio was defined by the smell of diesel and the sight of men coming home with coal dust settled deep in the creases of their faces, while other girls were playing with dolls. I was 14 years old and learning how to read complex railway maps. I could trace a shipment of steel from Pittsburgh to Chicago before I learned how to apply lipstick. That life prepared me for 20 years as a station agent, and eventually, for my role as chief dispatcher for Northwind Rail and Freight. For decades, my life was governed by the rhythm of the graveyard shift, sitting in a windowless room illuminated only by the red and green lights of the control board, ensuring that thousands of tons of moving metal did not collide in the dark. It was on those tracks that I met Robert. He was a maintenance engineer with grease permanently stained under his fingernails and a laugh that could rattle a window pane. We married in a simple ceremony and spent our savings on a small, drafty house right next to the switching yard. Most people would have hated the noise, but to us, the screech of braking wheels was a lullaby. We had one son, Daniel. He was the center of our universe, the bright spot in a life of hard labor and overtime. I can count on one hand the number of full nights of sleep I got when Daniel was growing up. I missed his 7th birthday because a derailment in Nebraska kept me on the radio for 30 hours straight. I missed school plays to pick up extra shifts so we could pay for his braces. I remember saving every single dollar bill I found in the laundry for 3 years just to buy him his first laptop when he got accepted to university. I wanted him to have the soft life I never had. I wanted him to work with his mind, not his back. I succeeded, but I never realized that a soft life can sometimes make for a hard heart. The first crack in my world appeared when Robert died. It was a massive heart attack right there in the maintenance shed. I had to plan his funeral between shifts because Northwind was short-staffed and the trains do not stop for grief. I threw myself into work to keep from drowning in the silence of my empty house. I worked my way up to regional manager, and when the company was eventually bought out, I walked away with a severance package and a pension fund that looked like a fortune to people like us. It was enough to ensure I would never be hungry or cold again. That money changed everything. It certainly changed the way Daniel looked at me. My son had grown into a slick financial advisor living in Denver, wearing suits that cost more than my first car. He married Lauren, a real estate attorney with a sharp smile and cold eyes. They lived in a sprawling house they could barely afford, leveraged to the hilt with loans. Every time we spoke, the conversation drifted from my health to my finances. They stopped calling it my savings and started calling it assets that needed to be optimized. 2 years ago, I had a minor stroke. It left my right hand numb and my reaction times slow. The doctor suggested I retire for good Daniel immediately suggested I sell the house Robert and I had built. He said I should move into a condo in Denver to be closer to him and Lauren. He said it was so they could take care of me. I believed him. I sold the house. I moved. I let them into my life completely. I sit here now on this freezing metal bench, and I think about the one thing Daniel does not know. Before Robert died, he insisted on seeing a lawyer named James Porter. Robert was a man who verified every signal before moving a train, and he treated our life the same way. He had a clause inserted into our joint will. It stated that the bulk of our estate would only be distributed after my death, and specifically, if there was any evidence of abandonment or abuse by the beneficiary, the entire sum would bypass the family and go directly to a charity for injured rail workers. I laughed at him when he signed it. I told him he was being paranoid and that our son would never do such a thing. I never thought I would need that piece of paper. I looked down at my empty hands, the hands that used to control the flow of commerce across 3 states, and I feel a bitter taste in my mouth. I sacrificed my sleep, my youth, and my body to push my son up the ladder of success. I just never thought that once he reached the top, he would look down and see me, not as the woman who raised him, but as a loose end that needed to be cut loose. I wonder when exactly I stopped being a person to him and became nothing more than a deposit he was waiting to clear. It started with a brochure Daniel placed on my coffee table, glossy and smelling of fresh ink. He proposed a trip on the Western Star Express, a luxury rail journey from Denver to the West Coast. He called it a 3-generation vacation, a chance for him, Lauren, my 15-year-old granddaughter Abby, and me to bond. Abby was sitting in the corner, her face illuminated by the blue light of her smartphone, thumbs flying across the screen. But when I looked at her, she offered me a soft, genuine smile. She was the only honest thing in that house. At dinner that evening, Daniel laid it on thick. He told me that I had spent my entire life working the rails but never actually enjoyed a proper scenic train ride. He said it was their treat, a way to honor me. I felt a mix of gratitude and guilt, so I insisted on contributing. I wrote them a check for $10,000 the next morning to cover my share and then some. It was meant to be a gift, but looking back, it was just the first drop of blood in the water. The dynamic shifted subtly after the money changed hands. Daniel and Lauren began having conversations that sounded sweet but felt sticky. They talked about how my retirement funds were just sitting stagnant in low-yield accounts. They used words like opportunity cost and asset optimization. Lauren suggested, over a glass of Chardonnay, that it might be easier if I signed a financial power of attorney so Daniel could help manage the portfolio while we traveled. I brushed it off, telling them I was perfectly capable of managing my own books. But the air in the room grew tight. A few nights before we were scheduled to leave, I went to the kitchen for a glass of water and heard hushed, angry voices. Daniel and Lauren were arguing. They did not hear me standing in the hallway shadows. They were talking about a luxury vacation rental project called Silver Pines Retreat. From what I could gather, they were underwater on the investment, and the bank was threatening foreclosure if they did not make a balloon payment soon. I heard Lauren's voice, cold and sharp. She said that if my money ended up going to doctors and nursing homes down the line, it would be a waste. She was talking about my life savings as if it were already hers. Daniel replied, his voice weak, saying that I was not frail enough to need a home yet. But he did not defend me. He did not say it was my money. He just sounded afraid of her. The day before our departure, Abby slipped into my guest room while I was packing. She sat on the edge of the bed, swinging her legs. She made a joke about her parents being stressed, but then her expression turned serious. She told me that if her mom and dad asked me to sign anything weird regarding money, I should not do it. She said I should not trust grown-ups too much. I laughed and patted her cheek, thinking she was just being a dramatic teenager. But a cold knot of anxiety began to form in my stomach. Boarding the Western Star Express felt like stepping into a different era. The sleeper cars smelled of lemon oil and polished mahogany. The vibration of the steel wheels beneath the floorboards was a sensation that usually calmed me, a reminder of my decades in the industry. However, the comfort was short-lived. As we settled into our cabins, Daniel offered to hold on to my purse for safekeeping. He said it would be safer if he kept all the passports and wallets in the master safe in his suite. I handed them over. I wanted to be an easy guest. I wanted to trust my son. Our first dinner on the train was in the first-class dining car, under the glow of golden sconces. The wine flowed freely, and so did the pressure. Daniel started talking about a new investment opportunity that could yield high returns if I agreed to liberate some of my assets. Lauren chimed in, smiling over the rim of her glass, saying that I deserved to be free from the burden of financial responsibility. She said it was time for me to rest. When Abby got up to take photos of the sunset through the observation window, the conversation turned predatory. Lauren suggested I change the beneficiary on my life insurance policy and move the bulk of my liquid cash into a trust that Daniel controlled. She made it sound like a safety measure. I tried to steer the conversation to the scenery, but I saw a flash of genuine anger in Daniel's eyes. He was running out of patience. That night, there was a soft knock on my cabin door. It was Abby. She looked terrified. She whispered that she had heard her parents arguing again about the bank debt. She told me they were desperate and that they were planning to pressure me until I broke. She begged me not to sign anything on this train. I pulled her into a hug and told her that people say things they do not mean when they are stressed. But as I lay in my bunk that night, listening to the rhythmic clatter of the tracks, I knew the truth. I was not on a vacation. I was on a business trip, and I was the merchandise. The morning sky was the colour of bruised iron when the Western Star Express hissed to a halt at Greyford Junction. It was a small transfer station tucked between the mountains, where the air bit at your skin with icy teeth. The public address system announced a 20-minute layover for crew changes and resupply. Daniel turned to me, his smile looking strained but polite. He suggested I go down to the platform to stretch my legs and get some fresh air to help with the stiffness in my knees. He told me that he and Lauren would stay behind to watch the luggage. It sounded like a kindness. I took my cane and stepped down onto the concrete platform. The air smelled of damp wood, ozone, and the sharp, chemical tang of creosote. It was the scent of my entire career, a smell that usually brought me comfort. I watched the steam rise from the undercarriage of the locomotive and felt a wave of nostalgia for the days when I was the one giving the orders to move. I saw Abby start to follow me out the vestibule door, but Lauren's hand shot out and clamped onto her shoulder. I heard her tell Abby that she needed help with something inside the cabin. Abby looked at me with wide, worried eyes, but she let her mother pull her back into the shadows of the train. I walked over to a small kiosk and bought a cup of black coffee. I spent a minute or two making small talk with the barista about the unseasonable cold. When I turned back toward the tracks, my stomach dropped. The train was moving. It was not just idling. The wheels were turning, grinding slowly against the steel rails. I dropped the coffee cup. It burst on the concrete, splashing hot liquid over my boots. But I did not feel the heat. I ran. I ran faster than I had moved in 10 years, waving my arms and shouting at the platform attendant that there was still a passenger on the platform. The attendant did not even look up from his clipboard. He simply stated that boarding was complete. I grabbed his arm, frantic, screaming that my son was still on that train. He pulled away, annoyed, and checked his list. He looked me in the eye and told me that the train was full and that according to his system, I was not on the passenger manifest for today. The words hit me like a physical blow. I shoved my hands into the pockets of my denim jacket, searching for my ticket, my wallet, my phone. My fingers met only lint and stitching. My pockets were empty. Then the memory washed over me, cold and clear. I remembered Daniel holding out his hand earlier that morning. He had said he would hold my purse for safekeeping so I could walk around the station comfortably. He had taken everything. I lunged toward the train, my breath tearing at my lungs. The whistle blew, a shrill scream that echoed off the mountains. The train picked up speed, the metal blurring into a silver streak. In the very last car, I saw a face pressed against the glass. It was Abby. She looked pale, her mouth open in a silent scream, her hand splayed against the windowpane. Then, I saw Lauren's hands grab her shoulders and yank her down out of sight. The train rounded a curve and vanished. The silence that followed was deafening. The wind whistled through the empty metal benches. The digital display board clicked over, showing the next train was hours away. I sank down onto the cold concrete, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I tried to tell myself it was an accident. I tried to believe they had just lost track of time, but deep down, I knew. This was not a mistake. This was a plan. 2 security guards escorted me into a small, windowless interview room. They sat me down and started asking questions. They wanted my son's phone number. They wanted his address. They wanted my social security number. I opened my mouth to answer, but my mind went blank. I realized with horror that I did not know Daniel's phone number by heart. I had simply pressed his name in my contact list for years. I gave them my name and details, but when they ran it through the computer, the result was the same. The system showed reservations for Daniel Hart, Lauren Hart, and Abigail Hart. There was no record of an Eleanor Hart ever boarding that train. I sat there, shivering in the fluorescent light, feeling like a ghost. They had not just left me behind, they had erased me. The female guard looked at her partner and tapped her temple, a silent signal that she thought I was senile. I was about to scream, to demand they check the cameras, when a voice cut through the tension. A woman stood in the doorway. She was a sturdy Latina woman in her 50s, wearing a faded trucker hat and holding a duffel bag. She looked at the guards and then pointed a finger straight at me. She told them that she had seen me eating dinner in the dining car the previous night with my family. She said she remembered me because I had laughed at a joke my granddaughter made. Her name was Rosa Martinez, and she was a long-haul trucker waiting for a connection. She walked into the room and stood next to me, crossing her arms. She told the guards that something was wrong here, and she was not going to let them treat me like a crazy person. For the first time since the train left, I took a breath. I was not alone. The security office was a small, boxy room that smelled of stale sweat and hot photocopier toner. I was sitting on a hard blue plastic chair that dug into the base of my spine, my hands clasping and unclasping in my lap. The security officer, A man named Miller was being patient, but I could see the exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders. He was polite, but his eyes told a different story. He did not believe that a wealthy son would simply leave his mother at a desolate station in the mountains. He thought I was confused. He thought I had wandered off and gotten lost in my own mind. Rosa sat in the chair next to me, her presence solid and grounding. She placed a plastic bottle of water on the desk in front of me and touched my arm. She asked me gently if there was anyone else she could call. She asked about other family. I shook my head, feeling the weight of my isolation. I told her Robert was gone. I told her my 3 siblings were all in their 80s, living in assisted care facilities 2 states away. I did not want to be the one to call them with this shame. I did not want to admit that I had raised a son who viewed me as disposable. Across the room, a young employee named Malik was hunched over a bank of monitors. He had been quiet for a long time, clicking through the archives of the station security feed. Suddenly, his clicking stopped. He frowned, leaning closer to the screen. He called Officer Miller over. I watched them whisper, pointing at the time code. Malik turned to me, his young face twisted in confusion. He told me that he had found the feed from the platform for the last hour, but the specific 5 minutes when the train stopped and passengers disembarked were gone. The screen just showed static and grey noise. He said it was a system glitch, but the look in his eyes said he knew that glitches rarely happen at the exact moment a crime is committed. Rosa made a noise in her throat, a sound of disgust. She pulled her smartphone out of her pocket. She told me that, without ID, the police would take days to figure this out. And by then, Daniel would be halfway to the coast. She suggested we use the internet. She wanted to take my picture and post it on Facebook and TikTok. She asked for my permission. My stomach turned. I have always been a private woman. The idea of plastering my face on a screen for strangers to pity was mortifying. But then I looked at the blank security monitor where my evidence should have been. I looked at the empty track outside. I realized I was trapped in a bureaucratic hole, and my silence was exactly what Daniel was counting on. I nodded. Rosa wasted no time. She made me hold my cold cup of coffee. She told me to look at the camera. I did not have to pretend to be sad. My eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. My hair was a mess from the wind. Behind me, the black screen of the security monitor loomed like a void. Rosa took 3 photos. Her thumbs flew across the screen as she typed a caption in both English and Spanish. She used words like elder abandonment and help needed. She tagged the rail line. She tagged the local news. I felt a bizarre mix of emotions as she hit post. Half of me wanted to crawl under the desk and die from the shame of having my family dirty laundry aired out to the world. But the other half of me, the part that had directed freight trains through blizzards and strikes, felt a grim satisfaction. I wanted the story to spread. I wanted to make sure Daniel could never walk into a room again without wondering if someone knew what he had done. While we waited, my mind raced to find a solution. I remembered James Porter. He was Robert's oldest friend and our family attorney back in Chicago. He was the only man alive who had the original copy of the will. I asked Malik to look up the number for Porter and Associates. He found it quickly, but when he dialed, it went straight to voicemail. It was late on a Saturday. The office was closed until Monday morning. I felt the hope drain out of me like water from a cracked cup. Night fell over Grayford Junction. The station emptied out until it was just the hum of the vending machines and the wind rattling the glass doors. Officer Miller said he had to lock up the office, but he let us stay in the waiting area. I expected Rosa to leave. She had her own truck to get to, her own life to live. But she grabbed her duffel bag and set it down on the bench opposite mine. She told me she was not going to leave me there alone. She said her mother would haunt her from the grave if she abandoned a woman in my condition. I watched her arrange her coat into a pillow. Tears pricked my eyes again, hot and fast. A stranger was showing me the kindness that my own flesh and blood had refused to give. Before she settled down to sleep, Rosa sat up and turned her phone screen toward me. The light was blinding in the dim room. She pointed to the numbers. The post had been up for only a few hours, but it had been shared 4,000 times. There were hundreds of comments. People were tagging news anchors. People were tagging the Elder Abuse Prevention Hotline. Strangers were offering to drive to the station to bring me food. I lay back on the hard metal bench, staring at the ceiling. I had no ticket. I had no wallet. I had no ID. But for the first time since the train pulled away, I had something else. I had a witness. And I had a story that was no longer just mine to carry. The next morning, the silence of the empty station was broken by the constant buzzing of Rosa's phone. It was vibrating against the metal bench like an angry hornet. She answered, listened for a moment, and then covered the microphone with her hand. She looked at me with wide eyes and told me that a reporter named Kayla Brooks from Mountain View News was on her way. Apparently, our Facebook post had exploded overnight, and the local news wanted the exclusive. When Kayla walked through the sliding glass doors an hour later, she looked like any other young professional in a sharp blazer. But there was something about her eyes that stopped me cold. I stared at her, searching the archives of my memory. And then it clicked. I asked her if her father was Thomas Brooks, a freight engineer on the magnificent Chicago line. She dropped her equipment bag, her eyes filled with tears. She told me that her father had spoken about me for years. I was the dispatcher who had halted a runaway chemical train just seconds before it would have collided with his engine. She was 10 years old back then. She looked at me and said that her father always told her that if she ever met Eleanor Hart, she owed her a life. It turns out that the rails connect us in ways we cannot see. Kayla set up her camera with a fierce intensity. She was not just doing a story, she was paying a debt. She asked Malik, the young security employee, to pull up the ticketing logs again. Malik typed furiously, eager to help now that the media was involved. He spun the screen around. It showed a transaction history that made my blood run cold. Daniel had originally purchased 4 tickets, but 3 days before the trip, there was a specific entry for a modification. He had cancelled the ticket for one senior passenger and changed the reservation to a lap infant status, which was an obvious system error that he must have forced through to remove my name from the manifest while keeping the seat assignment temporarily blocked. Kayla did not stop there. She used her press credentials to access a shared server for the transport company. She found footage from the corridor camera on the train taken right after we boarded. The video was grainy, but clear enough. It showed Daniel pushing my suitcase into the luggage hold and then slipping a thick white envelope into the pocket of a steward's uniform. The steward nodded and looked away. It was a bribe. It was a payoff to look the other way when an extra passenger disappeared at a stop. The realization hit me, triggering a memory from the week before we left. I was sitting in my kitchen, and Daniel had slid a stack of papers across the table. He told me they were just standard medical forms for the trip, in case of an emergency on the train. He had urged me to sign quickly. I remembered feeling tired, But something in my gut, a dispatcher's instinct for danger, made me hesitate. I told him I wanted to read them over with my reading glasses later. He had slammed his hand down on the table, a flash of pure rage crossing his face before he smoothed it back into a smile. He was trying to get power of attorney then. When that failed, he moved to Plan B. I also remembered a hushed phone call Robert made years ago. I had walked in on him speaking to James Porter. He was asking if the clause was ironclad. He said to James that he knew how ambitious our son was, and he wanted to ensure I was safe if he was not around to protect me. I had dismissed it back then as Robert being overprotective. Now, I realized he saw the sharks swimming in our own aquarium long before I did. Kayla made a call to James Porter's office in Chicago. It was a Saturday, but she managed to get through to an on-call legal assistant. After I verified my identity with my social security number and my mother's maiden name, the assistant confirmed it. The will had a specific spousal protection clause that froze all assets in the event of abandonment. Kayla looked at me and said she was going to run this as a breaking news segment for the evening broadcast. She was not just going to tell a story about a lost grandmother. She was going to frame it as a calculated case of financial elder abuse involving a prominent Denver financial advisor. She adjusted the lighting and clipped a microphone to my collar. For the final shot, she asked me if I had a message for my family. I looked directly into the black lens of the camera. I thought about Daniel, who was probably sipping champagne in the observation car right now, thinking he had won. I kept my voice steady. I said, "Daniel, if you are watching this, I know this was not an accident. I do not care about the money. I just want to know one thing. I want to know the exact moment you stopped seeing me as your mother and started seeing me as an obstacle you needed to remove." Kayla's report aired on the evening news, and within an hour, it had jumped from the television screen to the infinite echo chamber of the internet. My face, looking exhausted and framed by grey hair and a denim jacket, was suddenly everywhere. It was on YouTube, TikTok, and Facebook. It was playing on the overhead screens in airport terminals, in roadside diners, and, most importantly, it was playing on the smartphones of passengers aboard the Western Star Express. 200 miles to the west, in the dining car of that speeding train, the atmosphere began to shift. A couple dining near the window glanced at their phones and then looked up, scanning the room. One of them whispered that I looked exactly like the old woman who had been sitting at the next table the night before. The whisper spread like smoke. A waiter paused with a tray of drinks, looking at the freeze frame of my face on a tablet, and realized he had served me roast chicken just 24 hours ago. The seed of suspicion was planted, and it grew fast. Daniel saw the clip on his phone while sitting in his first-class cabin. I can only imagine the color draining from his face. He looked at the view count climbing by the second and felt the floor drop out from under him. Lauren, always the strategist, did not panic. She paced the small room and hissed a plan at him. She told him that they would stick to a narrative of dementia. She said they would claim I had wandered off in a confused state and that they believed I had reboarded. She told him to play the victim. She said they were just a worried family who had lost their grandmother. But they forgot about Abby. In the privacy of her bunk, my granddaughter was watching the video with headphones on. She watched me speak, her hands trembling. She pulled up the text messages I had sent her the night before. They were clear, funny, and sharp. She looked at the timestamps. She looked at the video again. There was no confusion in my eyes, only heartbreak. The realization hit her hard. Her parents were lying. The people who were supposed to protect her were the villains in the story. The situation on the train spiraled out of control in the corridor. A passenger, alerted by the growing murmur online, held up a phone as Daniel and Lauren argued outside their cabin. The microphone caught Lauren's voice, shrill and panicked. She shouted that they had deleted my name from the system and asked why he was hesitating now. That single sentence, captured in a grainy 10-second clip, was uploaded instantly. It provided the internet with the one thing it loves more than a tragedy, a villain to hate. Western Horizon Lines, the parent company of the train, found their social media accounts flooded with tags and angry comments. The public relations department panicked and called the train conductor, demanding an immediate investigation. The conductor pulled the internal logs and found a suspicious gap in the data recording exactly when the train was stopped at Grayford Junction. It was the digital fingerprint of tampering. Back at the station, the tide was turning in my favor. The Federal Elder Justice Initiative contacted the local police in Grayford, demanding that I be placed under protective custody. At the same time, they reached out to James Porter in Chicago. The legal machinery that Robert had set up decades ago began to grind into motion. On the train, Daniel received a call that probably stopped his heart. It was his bank. The representative informed him that his accounts had been flagged for suspicious activity and were being temporarily frozen pending a legal review initiated by Mr. Porter. The money he thought he had secured was suddenly locked behind a steel door. The heist had failed halfway through the getaway. Abby made her choice. While her parents were screaming at each other about the bank call, she sat on her bed and turned her phone camera on herself. She focused on her own shaking hands and then the screen showing my news report. She whispered into the microphone. She said, "Grandma, I believe you." She said she would tell the truth. She posted the video to her personal account. Within minutes, the caption "Granddaughter Speaks Out" was trending. The Western Star Express continued to hurtle toward the West Coast, but the luxury vacation was over. The air in the first-class cars grew heavy and suffocating. Passengers stopped talking when Daniel walked by. They stared. They pointed. Daniel walked down the corridor and felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. The train was still moving forward, but the tracks of his life had twisted, and he was beginning to realize that the derailment had already begun. The pressure from the media storm and the legal weight of James Porter forced the hands of the state authorities. By the next afternoon, a representative from the State Elder Protection Agency arrived at Grayford Junction with Kayla to escort me home. We did not take a train. We took a domestic flight back to Denver. As I walked out of that small, dusty station, I turned around one last time. I looked at the empty tracks stretching out into the grey horizon. That was where my old life ended, and this cold, new reality began. On the plane, I sat next to Kayla. She looked at me with concern etched into her young face. She asked me quietly if I was sure I wanted to take this all the way. She said that once we filed the charges, there would be no turning back. I looked out the window at the clouds and stayed silent for a long moment. Then I told her that I did not have a choice. I said that they had already cut all the tracks leading back to who we were. When we landed in Denver, I did not go to a hotel. I went to Rosa's apartment. It was a small, cozy place in a working-class neighborhood, filled with the smell of roasted peppers and laundry detergent. Rosa, a woman I had known for less than 48 hours, became my family when my own flesh and blood had turned into predators. We stayed up late, two women past 50, drinking tea and talking about our dead husbands and the children we raised. We talked about how the world starts to look through you when your hair turns grey, as if you are furniture that can be moved aside. James Porter arrived the next morning. He had driven all the way from Chicago, his old sedan covered in road dust. He sat at Rosa's kitchen table and placed a heavy leather briefcase in front of him. He pulled out the original copy of Robert's will and a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. He looked at me over his glasses and said that Robert had given him specific instructions. He was only allowed to hand me the envelope if I said a specific phrase. I took a breath that rattled in my chest. I said the words. I said my son left me on the tracks. Saying it felt like swallowing broken glass. Inside the envelope was a letter in Robert's handwriting. He had written it years ago. He predicted Daniel's ambition would eventually outgrow his morality. He wrote that if our son ever abandoned or abused me, I was to activate the supplementary clause immediately. The letter stated that every cent intended for Daniel would be transferred to a scholarship fund for the children of rail workers. There was also a provision for any grandchild who spoke up to protect me. Reading it, I realized Robert had been protecting me from the grave. I hesitated. For a moment, the anger faded, and I just felt the crushing weight of grief. I remembered Daniel as a boy with a fever of 104, clinging to me in the dark. I was terrified that if I did this, I would lose him forever. But then the image of Abby flashed in my mind. I saw her hand pressed against the glass of the train door, her face pale with fear. If I let this slide, I would be teaching her that betrayal is acceptable. I hardened my heart. James laid out the strategy. We were going to file charges for abandonment of an at-risk elder and financial exploitation. We had the camera clips, the system logs, and the sworn testimony of Rosa, Malik, Kayla, and now Abby. We were going to activate the asset transfer clause and strip Daniel of the inheritance he was so desperate to accelerate. I turned to Kayla and made one request. I asked her to do more than just tell my story. I wanted her to investigate the others. I wanted a report on the old men left in hospital waiting rooms and the grandmothers dropped off at bus stations. I wanted my pain to be a shield for someone else. The night before the confrontation, I sat by Rosa's window, watching the city lights blink like the signals in a switchyard. I told Rosa that I was not afraid of losing the lawsuit. I told her I was afraid of looking into Daniel's eyes and realizing that I did not recognize my own son anymore. We gathered around the kitchen table one last time. I placed my hand, calloused from years of throwing switches, on the wood. James placed the thick stack of legal files on top of it. Kayla placed her microphone down. Rosa tossed her truck keys onto the pile. Each of us brought a weapon to the fight. I looked at the collection and thought to myself that I used to control an entire rail network with just a few buttons. Now, I was going to take control of my own story. The return of the Western Star Express to Denver was not the quiet conclusion of a luxury vacation. It was a spectacle. As the massive engine rolled into Union Station, the platform was not filled with welcoming families, but with a sea of news cameras, microphones, and protesters holding signs that read, "Respect our elders and justice for Eleanor." The air was thick with the electricity of a public reckoning. I stepped out of the car wearing a grey wool coat and a bright red scarf that Rosa had lent me for courage. Rosa, Kayla, and James Porter flanked me like a security detail. My legs felt weak, trembling slightly under the weight of the moment. But then I heard it. A chant started from the back of the crowd. Strangers, People who had only seen my face on a screen were chanting my name. Eleanor. Eleanor. The sound washed over me, filling the hollow spaces in my chest where my son's love used to be. Daniel, Lauren, and Abby disembarked from a private accessway a few yards down. When Daniel saw the crowd and the picket signs, the colour drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure. Lauren was frantically pressing her phone to her ear, her voice shrill as she repeated the word misunderstanding to anyone who would listen, trying to spin a narrative that was already dead. The confrontation happened in the designated press area. Kayla stepped forward, her camera rolling live to thousands of viewers. She announced that this was the moment Eleanor Hart would face the family who left her behind. Daniel saw me and instinctively reached out. He took a step forward, his hand extended, and said the word, "Mom." His voice was cracking, desperate for a return to the dynamic where he was the child and I was the forgiving protector. I took half a step back, putting a visible distance between us. I looked at his hand, then at his face, and spoke clearly. I told him that Mrs. Hart was my name on the legal documents he had tried to erase. It was a quiet sentence, but it landed with the force of a slap. The cameras flashed in a frenzy. James Porter moved to the microphone. He did not shout. He simply presented the truth. On a large monitor set up behind us, he cycled through the evidence. The ticket system logs showed the deletion of my name. The grainy footage from the train corridor showed the bribe. The video of Daniel and Lauren arguing about the bank debt played, their voices echoing in the cavernous station. Finally, he projected the image of Robert's letter. The crowd went silent as they read the words of a dead father predicting his son's betrayal. Daniel tried to salvage the situation. He turned to the cameras, sweating, and fell back on the lie he had constructed. He claimed I was suffering from dementia. He said I had wandered off the train on my own, and that he had panicked, not knowing how to handle the crisis. His lie was cut short by his own daughter. Abby stepped out from behind her mother. She took the microphone from Kayla. Her hand was shaking so hard the device vibrated, but her voice was steady. She told the world that I was not confused. She said she had heard her parents discussing their debt and my money in the kitchen. She looked at her father and said she knew the truth. That was the breaking point, the breaking. Lauren, realizing the ship was sinking, shoved Daniel away from her. She shouted that it was all his idea and that she had just followed his lead. The image of their united front shattered instantly. Daniel looked at his wife, his eyes wide with shock, realizing he was completely alone. A representative from the State Elder Protection Agency stepped into the frame. He formally announced an official investigation and read a statement regarding my rights. He confirmed that the court had accepted the supplementary clause of Robert's will and that a temporary freeze had been placed on all access to the family trust. The station fell into a heavy silence. A reporter shouted a question from the back, asking if I had anything to say to my son. I looked straight into the camera lens, refusing to give Daniel the satisfaction of eye contact. I said that some railroad tracks become so warped that they can no longer carry a train. I said that when that happens, you can only tear them up. I told the world that today. I was tearing up the track between him and me. My words hung in the air, final and absolute, as the flashbulbs erupted one last time. The gavel hit the wooden block with a sound like a coupler locking into place. It was 3 months after the incident at Grayford Junction. I sat in the front row of the state civil court. Rosa was on my left. and Kayla was on my right, on the opposite side of the aisle. Daniel and Lauren sat hunched over, looking hollow and exhausted. My granddaughter, Abby, sat in the back with a court-appointed guardian, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The judge adjusted his glasses and read the summary of the case. He used words that hung heavy in the air. He spoke of the abandonment of an at-risk elder in a remote location. He spoke of the manipulation of travel documents and the intentional deletion of a passenger from a safety manifest. He looked directly at Daniel and emphasized the word premeditation. This was not a mistake. It was a strategy. James Porter stood up and presented the final piece of evidence. He held up Robert's letter. He explained the clause in the will to the courtroom. He stated that because of the proven abandonment, the entirety of the estate intended for Daniel would be redistributed. The assets were to be transferred to a new entity called the Robert and Eleanor Hart Scholarship Fund for the children of rail workers. He also announced that a separate educational trust would be established for any grandchild who had stood up to protect the deceased or the abandoned. Abby covered her face with her hands and wept silently when she heard her name. Daniel asked to speak. He stood up, his suit hanging loosely on his frame. He tried to sound remorseful, but it came out as a desperate justification. He talked about the crushing debt from the Silver Pines project. He talked about the fear of losing his own home. He admitted that he just wanted to teach me a lesson, so I would agree to transfer my assets. A gasp went through the room. In his attempt to explain himself, he had confirmed every single element of the crime. The judge did not hesitate. He sentenced Daniel and Lauren to probation and mandatory community service at state-funded elder care facilities. He banned them both from ever holding power of attorney or financial guardianship for any relative again. Then, he granted the motion to activate the disinheritance clause. Daniel lost everything. After the gavel fell for the last time, I walked out into the hallway. Daniel broke away from his lawyer and rushed toward me. His eyes were filled with tears. He called me Mom. He said he was wrong. He asked if there would ever be a day when I could forgive him. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized the cord between us had finally snapped. I told him that forgiveness is the longest route on the map. I said that maybe one day I would find the strength to travel it. But today, I had to get off the train at this station. I turned my back on him and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the corridor. The aftermath was swift. Lauren lost her clients and was let go by her firm due to the ethical scandal. Daniel was fired from his financial consultancy, and his name became a cautionary example in training seminars about elder financial abuse. They lost their big house and moved into a cramped rental apartment, living under the quiet judgment of their neighbors. My life went in a different direction. I bought a small bungalow near a spur line on the outskirts of Denver. In the evenings, Rosa comes over, and we water the garden together. Kayla joins us for dinner on Sundays. Abby stays with me on the weekends. The scholarship fund Robert and I created has already sent acceptance letters to 3 young men who wear yellow safety vests on the docks, the kind of kids nobody else ever thinks about. One evening, I sat on my wooden porch chair, listening to the distant rumble of a freight train passing through the valley. Abby rested her head on my shoulder and asked me if I still believed in family. I stroked her hair and told her that I believe in the people who stay on the platform when the train has already left. Kayla sent me a link later that night. Her podcast series about my ordeal had reached millions of listeners. The image of me sitting on that cold bench at Grayford Junction had become a symbol for a nationwide movement protecting the elderly. I looked at the screen, then looked out at the dark horizon. They left me at a station, thinking an old woman would just get lost and fade away. They forgot that I spent my life memorizing schedules and controlling the flow of traffic. A woman of the railway always knows which train is coming back around, and the revenge train is never late. If you were in my shoes, would you pull the emergency brake on a toxic relationship, or would you let it crash into the ravine? Tell me your story, because every painful memory is just a signal light in the dark. And tonight, I am the one manning the station. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below to share your location and your thoughts on what happened. Do not forget to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and press the hype button to help this story reach even more people.